Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 Online Solutions Dialogue on Infrastructure Asset Management. For today, we're discussing climate resilient asset management. This is already our third installment, so I'm pretty sure you're already familiar with our Zoom functions available today. But just for a quick review, let me walk you through and remind you that interpretations are available today. So we have simultaneous interpretations available in French. So if you could please check the interpretation button if you want to listen in French. You will have to have your Zoom updated for this function to work. So in case you cannot see the interpretation button, that means you will have to log off the meeting, quickly update your Zoom, and then join back. And again, as usual, please introduce yourself in the chat. So if you can all type your name, country, and government agency so we can get to know you, please use the chat for this. And also, for any thoughts and questions, feel free to use the chat box as you want so that we can keep track of your questions and insights. And we'll do our best to return everyone's question. And lastly, we would like to invite you again to turn on your video cameras to make the workshop human. And just as a tip, be ready to turn on your cameras at the end of the workshop too, as we will be taking a class photo at the end. So make sure you're going to be camera ready all the way until the end. So with that, I'd like to formally turn over the workshop to our project lead, Mr. Daniel Platts, to deliver his opening remarks. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Juana. Welcome everyone to the Online Solutions Dialogue. Today, we're focusing on climate resilience. It's great to see you all again, and thank you again for being so engaged throughout the process. This is the third workshop for many or most of you. As you know, this workshop will also result in a certification process. Everyone that participated in all three workshops and has been doing the homework and handing in the assignments will be eligible for a UN certificate of basic knowledge on infrastructure asset management. And with that certificate, you can then receive further technical assistance, as well as in addition, you're eligible to apply for the UNCDF International Investment Fund. We'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of the workshop, and including what the next steps are for this particular project and our work at the UN on infrastructure asset management. I would also, again, love to introduce to you our consultants today that are working with us on delivering this dialogue. You all know Francis Barnawe, who is a senior consultant with UNDESA and a former town clerk in a lot of municipalities in Uganda. You see them listed there. And of course, very importantly, our chief instructor for today, his name is Dustin Carey. He's a capacity building officer with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and he's really been at the forefront of Canada's efforts to make sure municipalities and local governments in Canada are climate resilient and can really assess and deal with climate change. And this is the goal for today. I think you've all seen the effects of climate change all over the continent and in other parts of the world where you are. And today we're talking about how to assess those risks, how to assess how vulnerable we are, and what can we do about it? And do we need to do something about it? So all these questions are questions every nation on earth is asking itself right now. And Dustin, we're very proud to have him, has been at the forefront in Canada to lead the effort there for the municipalities. With that being said, again, welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and I hand it over to, excuse me, I hand it over to Francis for a few words on the expectations for today. Thank
you. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Juana. I also welcome participants to this last workshop on asset management. You recall that we are here about 3 weeks back when we are looking at how you can capture data and utilize it to be able to manage your asset management in your institutions. But you're also aware that you're operating in a world of change where things are changing, weather is changing, climate is changing, and therefore must make sure the type of asset management we build must be strong enough to be able to withstand the challenges of these hazards, because as we experience changes in climate and weather, they come with enormous hazards that greatly affect our infrastructure. And therefore, we need to talk about the type of asset management that is quite resilient to all forms of crisis if you are to be able to achieve sustainable development in our institutions. And therefore, we are going to look at what we are going to achieve in this workshop on building crisis resilient asset management. Proceed. We are going to have a clear understanding on what crisis resilient means in the context of asset management. We should also be able to analyze the impact of climate change on our infrastructure and also go further to look at the benefits and the challenges of a climate resilient asset management. We should also be able to identify local hazards that might affect our infrastructure at our places of work. You are aware you might be having a number of local hazards, and no matter how local they are, they may be able to greatly impact on your assets. So therefore, we need to identify them and be able to address them so that we make our infrastructure more resilient. We're also going to learn how we are going to conduct a climate risk assessment and generate information to make climate resilience part of our best practices in asset management. We are talking about climate resilience because you can't deal with the climate, and therefore we must make sure we talk about resilience because you can't avoid the climate, and therefore we have to talk about resilience so that because that is the way to go. We're also going to learn how to assess vulnerability of our assets to each of the climate impacts so that we acquire greater value from them. Our assets are vulnerable to a number of climate impacts, and therefore it is important that we assess the extent to which they are vulnerable so that we are able to take action and protect them from this vulnerability to be able to get maximum value out of them, like we have been saying before. Next. We're also going to learn how to protect our natural resources against climate hazards for the benefit of our communities. You are aware climate change affects natural resources like the wetlands, green spaces, and the forests. And therefore, we must make sure that we protect them against these changes or these hazards for the benefit of our people in our communities, wherever they are. We must also be able to make an impact statement that articulates how certain hazards will affect service delivery. Impact statement, they are like problem statement in research. And when you come up with this, they will help you to know the extent of your problem. And once you have known your problem, then you shall be able to devise means on how we can protect these hazards from affecting service delivery. So these impact assessments are very, very critical because they tell you what type of a problem is, and eventually they energize you or motivate you on how to solve them and be able to have sustainable development. We are going to see how to formulate a response strategy of our assets in order to enhance the adaptive capacity to climate change. Like I said before, climate change is inevitable, and now we are talking about adaptation because you can't deal with the climate. It's like we are now living with the COVID. You can't deal with the COVID. So the best way is to make sure you adapt, to make sure we see strategy on how we are going to have our assets be able to respond to these risks so that we can mitigate the impact on them. But also at the end of the day, you will work away with tips on how you can create resilient asset management plan. You have been able to make asset management action plans. I'm going to talk briefly how far we have now gone. And therefore, these asset management action plans will not be useful if we don't make them climate resilient. So it is important that we make them climate resilient so that they can be able to achieve the intended purposes for which we make them and formulate them. So they have to be climate resilient to achieve the intended benefits. But also we shall have to learn how to increase awareness of climate resilient asset management in organizations and communities. Now, for us as people who come for these workshops, once we have learned and keep quiet, it won't help. We must make sure we go to organizations, we make people aware, the community is aware, because asset management is a function of everybody, so that everybody benefits from what we are learning. This is what we intend to cover in the day today, by the close of the day today. And I think I'm urging all of you to make sure you keep around and be able to attend, because if you just go away, you need to be able to attend up to the end all these things we have talked about as intended benefits. Now, about the performance of the workshop of the assignments, we have so far received about 35. By yesterday, we had received 35 assignments. That is on AMAP. That is action management. That was action management action plans, and about 28 plans were approved, and 5 were deferred for making minor corrections. But I'm happy today, many people I'm seeing submissions, many people are submitting. So I think I'm urging you to make sure you submit your plans, because we had put tomorrow 31st as deadline for submission of the first assignment. I've also received about very few on the second assignment, and therefore we are urging all of you, because attendance is one thing, doing assignments is one another. Attending and not working on assignments will not make eligible for funding and for certification, like Daniel said. I once again thank you for coming, and I thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank
Over
you,
to you,
Francis,
Dustin.
for that message. Yes.
Thank you very much for that excellent overview, Francis. So, as noted, my name is Dustin Carey with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. I have a Master's of Climate Change degree, which I received from the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. And I've been working at this intersection between climate risk and adaptation and asset management for about 4 years now, and have led a number of national training sessions across Canada. Was the project manager of a guide which has become a bit of a standard across the nation as well, and that was a major inspiration behind the chapter of within the handbook. So you will have seen this slide in the last OSD on data management. And really the intention of sharing it now is to show where the overall context of climate resiliency fits within the asset management process, and where this OSD fits. And really noting those two highlighted parts is that climate risk is a large and emerging risk acting upon assets and services, but it is ultimately one risk among several that should be considered. This isn't a entirely separate process within your asset management system. It's an additional lens that needs to be considered in order to make sure that you get the maximum value out of those assets, and ultimately work to ensure that the investments you make today get the maximum benefit as the climate and operating parameters that it's expected to operate within change. And just to provide a good example of why climate, environmental, and disaster risk needs to be a consideration, this is an example from a training program offered by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. This wastewater treatment plant was kept within a very good state of repair. In a infrastructure assessment done about a year before this event, it was noted as good, or about 80% of the expected lifespan still remaining. But it was situated in a flood prone area. It was within a 1 in 100 year floodplain. So between inundation and damages to the plant, it was offline for quite a number of weeks. So in this case, the greatest risk to service interruption, major inconvenience to the residents of that community, to environmental harm, to falling out of regulatory compliance, as well as damage to the asset and the financial cost associated with that, all came from the location and design of that asset rather than the condition it's held or it was within. And I also want to make it clear that this chapter was drafted with the intention of making it accessible. There are a number of more detailed and by and large more costly studies that can be undertaken to bolster the reliability and robustness of the process that we're going to be looking at in this. Things like floodplain mapping using airplane-based LiDAR to create digital elevation models, engineering threshold analyses, really in-depth sewer modeling of your entire linear assets, things like that. But a higher level assessment that's really reliant on the embedded expertise within your community, making use of planners, operating staff, financial staff, things like that, can still be very useful in refining asset plans to build climate resilience without the absolute need for these more in-depth components. The overall learning objectives that I had in mind when designing this OSD are broadly to increase the awareness of climate resilient asset management practices among everyone in attendance, to build the capacity for attendees to implement climate risk assessment frameworks within their community, and ultimately to drive a desire to be an agent of change within your local government. If climate resilience is not yet a real priority within your local government, I hope that this training session and referring to the guide afterwards helps to change that. I think Francis has already done an excellent job of going over what to expect today. So for some of the contextual why, think about climate resilient asset management, public services really require public infrastructure to operate. If infrastructure assets are not maintained within a serviceable and operating condition, the quality of life of residents within your community will decline. It's really as simple as that. Businesses will not be able to grow without adequate services. Investment will not occur to the degree that is desired, and ultimately people will not be able to thrive. Planned infrastructure is designed and built to operate under a number of parameters, determining its capacity. And some of those parameters include things like the climate and environmental factors that will be acting upon it, the use or demand load, as well both today and into the future. And because of shifting climate conditions, past conditions will no longer be an adequate indicator of what those assets are going to be required to operate within. Future conditions now, more than any other time in the past, are going to have to be considered to make sure that that investment lives up to what you're designing it to. And the climate constantly acts on all assets within your inventory, and all infrastructure is, to one degree or another, exposed to climate change. The key, and really the intention of this OSD to prioritize, is to determine whether that exposure overcomes a threshold where it becomes a risk of adequate severity that you have to worry about it. And one of the reasons that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities started really this making this a priority in local governments across Canada, and has really sold me on it, the power of asset management to build community-wide climate resilience, is that asset management is a way to change and direct activities throughout your municipal operations and processes, including towards risk management. It's very much a systems approach, meaning that a series of small changes in decision processes multiplied by the thousands, in the case of a small local government, up to millions in a very large one, of decisions made every year in that local government can accumulate to a very substantial result. This isn't a case of single decisions, single reactions. It is very much a case of building that more so from the ground up result. And there are quite a number of benefits associated with making your asset management processes more resilient to climate change. A few of the main ones include um, more reliable services provisions that results from it, making your services and assets more resilient to climate change ultimately reduces the interruptions and avoids service loss consequences associated with it. Building climate resilience practices into your asset management processes will improve the asset lifespan of those assets by ensuring that they are built to expectations of future conditions, while existing assets can be maintained to meet changing conditions until a point of renewal, retrofit, or replacement. Climate resilient asset management or lower life cycle costs for those assets. Infrastructure costs a great deal. There's no escaping that reality. So you want to get the maximum value out of an asset by using it to the full advantage throughout its life cycle. Preventing asset failures or full reconstructions, either due to damage or inadequate capacity to meet the expected loads upon it, will, with adaptable design and management practices, means that you will get better value from that investment. Asset management practices that management risk will increase the attractiveness of your community to investors. For instance, it is one component that the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment does tend to look at. And ultimately, your community is likely to experience co-benefits associated with more climate resilient management of services and assets, including things like more green space, local economic development, and disaster risk reduction preparedness. But unfortunately, it is not all good news. There are, while there are extensive benefits to climate resilient asset management, there are a number of barriers inherent to these changes that are likely to occur as well and will need to be overcome. Including things like timelines. Ultimately, you are not sure when or even if a climate event of a certain magnitude will occur, especially on climate indices where we have less confidence, ultimately, things like very heavy precipitation events or strong wind events. So you are incurring costs now that will work to avoid greater cost and damages into the future, but you can't be sure exactly when that will occur, making the business decision a little bit more tricky. Uncertainty. You don't know exactly how much the climate will change or how intense future events will be. There is still a great degree of uncertainty within model and scenario uncertainty that you'll have to take into consideration. Awareness. Your local government staff, your council, consultants you may be working with, or higher orders of government may not be aware of the need to adapt. So that may be an awareness challenge to overcome. Local capacity in terms of things like the ability within your local government to access and interpret climate information, determining engineering thresholds or the ultimate vulnerability of the asset systems you're working with, or assessing some of the consequences associated with risks, and things like policy misalignment. Um, for instance, a procurement policy that mandates the most affordable option be chosen, even if spending more now can ultimately reduce challenges later. So I did seem to have missed the first one. So can catch up with a few. Now, can we launch the first Zoom poll, please? So the first poll, just want to get a little bit of perspective on who we have attending. Have you experienced events within your local government that you can attribute to climate change? It's really something beyond which you've likely experienced in the past. And some of the options are extreme heat, severe flooding, more intense drought, intense storms, a different type of climate hazard, or no, you haven't experienced anything yet? Okay. Large percentage of the very large percentage of those who replied did note that yes, hazard events are changing because of climate change. You're seeing the results of that with somewhat unsurprisingly flooding and heat being the primary ones that have been experienced so far. So can we launch poll number 2, please? So other one, this doesn't necessarily have to be climate related. I'm just hoping to get a little bit of a perspective of your experience assessing risk so far. So have you undertaken a risk assessment within your community? This can be for infrastructure or other priorities, and could include anything from regulatory risk, legal risk, um, to climate or other environmental harm. Okay, so we're coming up with about half of those in attendance. This is their first experience with a risk assessment process, and about 45% at having one completed or having one currently ongoing. And for the last one for this, just this moment, could we launch poll number 3 as well, please? So taking a look at these challenges that I've just explained, some of the ones that are really inherent in this process, do you have any that you think will be the most difficult to overcome within your community? Yeah, seeing pretty even split across each of these ones that are each of the options. The current front runners being local capacity, just making sure that there are the capabilities within your local government, as well as that uncertainty of the future, awareness, inertia or fear of change, and policy misalignment, each concerns as well. The one that doesn't really seem to be as much of a consideration is the delayed benefits. So yeah, seeing that um, change within or timeline change within the investment today and benefit tomorrow seems to be less of a concern. So if bit of an opportunity to share your local government's experiences with others in attendance, if you have overcome these some of these challenges associated with other risks for within your community. Doesn't necessarily have to be climate related, but if you have experience overcoming them that you're able to share in the chat, I am sure the other attendees would find that extremely useful. So changing a little bit over to the climate change side of things. So since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been emitting an ever increasing amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, primarily through the combustion of fossil fuels, deforestation, and agricultural practices. And really prior to that, natural emissions in this fairly low amount that we emitted was in balance with the overall capacity of natural systems to reabsorb it. So the overall concentration in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide didn't really change. So this increase since the late 1700s or so has been impacting the energy balance of the planet, acting like a blanket around it that just keeps getting thicker over time. And this is working to change the balance between the incoming solar radiation, which hasn't changed at all, and the amount of outgoing long wave or infrared radiation that less is ultimately escaping the planetary system as a result of that thicker blanket. Um, as a result, more heat is being retained within the climate system every day. And this is accumulating within the world's oceans, the atmosphere, ice caps and glaciers, as well as lands and soils. And this excess heat is shifting the climate norms that we have become used to, manifesting itself in changes to atmospheric temperatures, weather patterns, sea surface temperatures, the strength, frequency to a lesser degree, primarily the strength associated with hurricanes, melting sea and terrestrial ice, precipitation patterns, and increased evapotranspiration and increased lightning strikes. And climate change operates on the time scale of decades on the lower end, meaning that it is tracked through rather gradual changes of long scale global weather patterns. More short-term weather patterns, things like overall hurricane season or cyclone season, monsoon season, instances of dry seasons or short-term droughts, extreme rainfall events, things like that aren't necessarily examples of climate change, but they can be influenced by climate change. So even in the absence of climate change, it's likely that most of those events may still be experienced. The difference is climate change is shifting the intensity or magnitude or frequency of those events, really no weather pattern now operates independent of those changing background conditions. Climate models are mathematical tools that stimulate the physical interconnections between the climate system, through which we can get projections or sort of scenario forecasts of the future of what the climate may look like in response to enhanced forcings acting upon it, namely the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the future. We use different scenarios called representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. Um, as of the last IPCC report, new scenarios are currently under development, which will be released in the next IPCC report, to model how much CO2 we emit and ultimately how much climate change we experience as a result of that. Um, so we aren't sure exactly what future climate conditions will look like. There are a number of areas of uncertainty built into these scenarios. Um, a smaller degree being things like model uncertainty. To produce these RCPs, scientists run an ensemble of more than 40 different global climate models and run them thousands of times each to get a good indication of what the result is likely to be. But as you can see in the model uncertainty on the graph on the right, there is still a fairly high degree of what the response will be within that certain scenario. But ultimately, the higher degree of uncertainty comes from scenario uncertainty. Ultimately, will the world really get its act together and start reducing emissions with the intensity that scientists have called for? So getting down to things like RCP 2.6, which is in line with the goals set under the Paris Agreement. Or do we really ignore the science globally, continue emitting really at a pace that we currently are, and align more with RCP 8.5, that worst case scenario? When conducting climate risk assessments, I really do recommend using multiple scenarios for analysis. It's good to use the RCP 8.5 just to get an indication of some of those worst case scenario examples of how conditions may change, even if that is not the basis that you design infrastructure to. It may be too expensive to really adapt to that, but having an example of that worst case for at least the highest risk events is a very good practice. And you can augment that with other scenarios like RCP 6 or 4.5. So now have just a brief video to share, though I am not sure I clicked the button to share sound. So just 1 second. Okay, apologies. Climate model information is incredibly complex, and without a dedicated climate scientist on your team, you're unlikely to be able to use the raw model data to inform your decision-making processes. Thankfully, a number of internationally available resources can be used in order to facilitate this process. And I'll provide a quick demonstration of a few of them here. This first resource offered by USAID allows you to take a look at some of the primary climate risks associated with each country in the world. Taking a look at the climate risk profile for Nepal, for instance, we can see that by mid-century, the climate of the country is likely to warm by about 1.6 to 2.2 degrees Celsius. Overall annual precipitation is likely to slightly increase. Meanwhile, extreme rainfall events are likely to rather dramatically increase by 36 to 52% by 2050. There is projected to be a reduction in water quality as well as water supply. All of this has the potential to impact hydropower development within the country. Scrolling down a little bit further, you can see some of the key sectoral vulnerabilities, with infrastructure being one of the most prominently highlighted within this risk report. The organization Carbon Brief has produced a number of very high quality resources that are internationally available. This one, for instance, takes a look at global historical and future warming projections under each of the representative concentration pathways. If we, for instance, click on a grid cell within South Africa, we can see that, or how the grid cell is likely to warm going forward across RCPs 2.6, 4.5, 6, and 8.5. And this.
So just in the interest of time, this video will be made available to everyone within the slide deck, but it does go through a number of the resources noted in the guide as climate projections. And one additional one will be sent to you just a little bit later in this workshop to work with to fill out the first step of the homework assignment associated with it.
Is information that.
So there are quite a number of complex interconnections between climate hazards and infrastructure assets, the failure of which can result in the suspension of municipal services that the community relies upon. Climate change has the potential to greatly impact the effectiveness and lifespan of assets, which can result in inconvenient, costly, or even dangerous service failures. And depending on the characteristics and severity, climate events can cause asset operating thresholds to be exceeded, and this can result in either temporary loss of service and damage, the destruction, or even critical failure of that asset. And using past examples of how severe weather can provide indications of how severe climate change events can be in the absence of climate resilient activities. For instance, the intensification of drought systems can critically imperil water supplies, as was seen in Sao Paulo's main reservoir in 2015 and Cape Town between 2015 and 2018. And within the guide, the appendix of chapter 6, there is a chart that demonstrates quite a number of climate infrastructure interactions. You'll be sent this, one page of this a little bit later on for an exercise, but it can be useful throughout this risk assessment process for scoping out some of those impacts. Ooh. I don't know why that jumped to the end. There we go. Engineered assets are designed to so that the capacity of an asset is exceeded. So that the capacity of an asset will exceed the load placed upon it, or that if that asset capacity is exceeded, for instance, in the case of stormwater pipes, then additional components of a broader asset system will manage the rest of the load. As a result of shifting climate conditions or a deteriorating asset, the load may become more likely to exceed the asset capacity. Any period where this happens introduces vulnerability. a design safety factor was likely introduced into the design of that asset, but as a result of things like changing demand or usage and climate change, um, um, changing the load, as well as things like weathering, age, improper construction, neglecting maintenance, or incorrect operations, the capacity of that asset may decrease over time as well. So as a result, even if climate changes aren't particularly large, particularly in the near future, if other factors have imperiled or impacted the capacity or load of an asset, climate change can act as a little bit of a last straw effect that leads to those periods of vulnerability. And if you've gone through this chapter, looked at that appendix of some of those climate hazard infrastructure interactions, it may be natural to wonder, how do we adapt all of these systems to climate change? And it's a bit of a simple reality that you can't. Asset management requires balancing of levels of service with cost and risk management requires responding to some of those priority risks first. There's always going to be a degree of residual vulnerability. It's just too expensive to think about getting rid of all of risks or out designing all risks. So instead, it's important that your energy and investment be focused on where it will make the greatest difference. It's also important to note that the entire asset system may be vulnerable due to one critically exposed component. For instance, a rail line being vulnerable due to one undersized culvert. Having an understanding of those interconnections between asset systems can help you build the resilience of the system as a whole by identifying those smaller weaknesses. And in earlier lessons, you will have learned about critical assets. Some of those most important pieces of infrastructure needed to ensure that critical components of services continue to be delivered. Um, if you have not yet identified critical assets in your community, think for the purposes of this lesson of the assets which, if taken offline, would cause the most significant harm to your community through service interruption. Those assets can form the basis of this climate risk assessment, identification, and management exercise. So going to turn it over to an online polling platform just for a moment to get your perspective. So could share the Mentimeter link in the chat, please. So for this first online poll, you can go to menti.com and punch in the access code that has been shared in the chat. And the first question looking to get an indication on is just, when you think of critical assets in your community, what immediately comes to mind? So water coming up as the most common theme in terms of primarily potable water supply, but also sewer infrastructure, as well as flood prevention, including a number of other more point source infrastructure like hospitals and schools, utilities, primary healthcare center, absolutely. Much of the linear road network, okay. So for the next question, so think back to most of the people here did notice that or note that they had experienced a climate event, a severe climate event. So think back to that. If it were to become worse, what critical asset within your community may be exposed to damages? I'm afraid I don't know what a GS is. So roads and waterways coming up a lot. Again, quite a bit of water infrastructure, housing and utilities, absolutely. Pumping stations, absolutely. Unfortunately, a lot of them around the world tend to be situated in floodplains. Hospitals, roads, schools, and buildings. Bridges, absolutely. So, and electrical supply. So some really good answers here. And for the for that asset that you did note, if it were damaged, what are some of the services that could be interrupted associated with that are really reliant on that asset? And you can choose as many as you think are related. So yeah, some of those really critical ones coming up are drinking water supplies, transportation services, and healthcare services, so far being the um, most noted to exposure. Okay. Excellent job so far. So for this next one, going to give you an opportunity to work on your own for just a few minutes. So you'll see in the chat been provided a link to a World Bank climate knowledge portal. So within that, like you to click on it and choose your country, or hit country rather. It'll bring up a map where would like you to select your own nation. That will bring up this screen, and on that header bar, you'll see climate data. If you click that, it will bring up a projections tab, projections looking at future climate data. And under that, if you scroll down a little ways, you'll find this table for looking at different climate variables and time periods. And I'd like you to just take a moment to explore that. Look at some of those different climate variables, look at some of the different time periods, and just get an indication of one climate projection for your community. This is going to be used in the first step of the homework assignment for this OSD. So if you can do that and just type into the chat your nation, the climate projection, and the time period. And if your national government has put out accessible climate projections, you are welcome to use those as well. There is a degree of regional appropriateness that does have to be taken into consideration with climate projections, and by and large, the larger the country, the more geographic variability, the less appropriate that national climate projections do tend to be. Regional, the closer down regionally you can get, does tend to be really useful, and often it's national governments that do provide that level of data. So I'll just give everyone a moment to work with that portal. And again, if you can type into the chat what your country is, the climate projection it is likely to experience, and the time period that you looked at. And I just put an example into the chat that we'll be using just a little bit later on for a group exercise. So using this platform and scrolling down to that hot days where maximum temperature is greater than 40 degrees Celsius. The Nigeria, for instance, is likely to experience 28 days with temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius by 2040 to 2059. So well within the lifespan of assets that are currently being designed. So for the sake of time, I'm going to proceed, but if you haven't yet posted it in the chat, encourage you to do so. And again, this will be the first step in the homework assignment for this session. So in order to implement response strategies that will improve your ability to deliver services in the face of climate change, you need to have an understanding of what you must adapt to. Climate risk assessments are an approach to identifying potential hazards from climate-related projections and events. The results are used to develop strategies to avoid or manage risks. The risk assessment framework within the guide is based on the ISO 31000 risk management framework, an internationally recognized set of guidelines. Risk management requires trade-offs between risk minimization and cost. It becomes more expensive and increasingly challenging to prepare for events that present only modest consequences or are really unlikely to occur. As you work down that prioritized list, the more that you ultimately end up taking on, the more expensive it gets. So the cost of protection must be weighed against the consequences of damage and disruption. And the 5 main steps involved in the framework and the guide are hazard identification, climate impact statements, a vulnerability assessment, which screens out hazard impacts that are of relatively low concern, a risk assessment that evaluates the likelihood and consequence of impacts, and a strategic evaluation that works to place the results within your community. After that, you can work on designing those response strategies and integrating them into your asset management plan. And the first step in identifying the hazards you are likely to face in the future is thinking about those you have already experienced. So while the past is not an indicator of the future, is not in the same sense that it was used to be relied on for infrastructure planning, it provides an initial indication of exposure for all of those responses early on that noted that you've already experienced a severe climate event that you attribute to climate change. You can probably bet on climate events of similar magnitudes happening again and potentially of greater magnitudes into the future. The next and slightly more challenging step is to use climate projections covered in that previous component to infer future risk. If you are unable to work with a climate scientist for this, some of the globally available platforms like that World Bank knowledge portal, like the ones noted in the video that will be circulated and in the guide, typically provide a sufficient level of robustness for a high level screening that can inform risk reduction measures. But they do tend to be, it does tend to be difficult to get a level of information for really highly detailed engineering threshold analyses with freely available ones. Instead, a combination of past event magnitude and future projections can offer an indication of whether those experiences will get worse and will form much of the basis of identifying impacts. So for climate impact statements, the second step of the risk assessment framework, assessing risks requires considering both the likelihood of climate hazards and their consequence. To identify the consequence of a particular hazard, you will need to define the relationship between that community's hazards and the services it provides. While some hazards are increasing annual temperatures are virtually certain to occur, without that added context of what it will mean for the community, you can't assess the seriousness of how it will impact the assets and services. So as with other steps in this process, it is best to undertake it within a workshop setting. It's best not to undertake this full scope of work alone within your local government. Bring together a broader asset management team that can help think through these components. Operation staff, for instance, are absolutely invaluable in this process. Climate impact statements articulate how certain climate hazards will affect public health, service delivery, local assets, community finances, or the environment. But a hazard does not need to meet each of these criteria to be included. Its impact on service delivery may take a number of different forms. And it's useful to structure climate impact statements in a certain way so that a consistent logical approach can be applied. For instance, the example presented here, a particular climate hazard impacting a service area or asset resulting in a specific consequence. And to provide a couple of examples, intense rainfall, flooding, roadways impairing emergency response, prolonged rainfall overwhelming wastewater treatment plant capacity, causing a combined sewer overflow, drought limiting drinking water delivery, imperiling human health, or drought limiting water delivery, imperiling agricultural yields. So as you can see, that consequence can take a number of different forms. The figures on climate hazards, climate hazard impacts, and assets related to certain services within the guide can all be useful to help brainstorm some of these climate impact statements. And it's also important to note that you shouldn't feel like you need to limit the number of climate impact statements that you come up with your team. It is far better to be thorough and come up with a large number of impact statements than it is to leave potentially very important risks unanalyzed. So to provide just a bit of an indication of some of the risks that can occur relatively locally, I've asked Francis to do just a little bit of asking around of climate risks, events that have occurred, severe climate events, and if any adaptation exercises have occurred to deal with them in his local region. So Francis, want to turn it over to you for a few minutes just to discuss some of these case studies that you did come across. So Francis, want to turn it over to you for a few minutes. Francis, want to turn it over to some of these case studies that you did come across.
Come again, Dustin.
Just wanted to turn it over to you for a moment to discuss some of these local risks that you came across. For instance, the story behind these infrastructure damage, or I believe the drought reservoir case study you came across.
Yeah, thank you, Dustin. Like this picture you will see here, that is the floods. Those are the floods in Gududa. You can see the flood. These are the. Dustin.
Just wanted to turn it over to you for a moment to discuss some of these local risks that you came across. For instance, these infrastructure damage, or I believe these infrastructure damage, or I believe
Yeah, thank you, Dustin. Like this picture you will see here. Dustin. That is the floods. Those are the floods. That is the floods. Those are the floods. You can see the Gududa. These are the. You can see the. Microphone. My microphone has a problem.
It's good now.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, can hear you. Not currently getting that feedback, but if it starts up again, maybe best to skip this session.
My microphone has a problem. My microphone has a problem.
Yeah, we're getting it again. Perhaps it's best to just move on.
Hello?
Yeah, can hear you.
Hello?
Not currently getting that feedback, but not if it starts getting that feedback, but if it.
Yes, let's proceed. Thanks, Francis.
So going to turn it over to the first breakout session for this. It'll be your responsibility to work with your breakout room to produce a climate impact statement. So using that climate change knowledge portal that we provided earlier, you can see from that the country of Nigeria is expected to see a pretty dramatic increase in the number of days over 40 degrees Celsius. The overall numbers being days with temperatures over 40 degrees Celsius are projected to increase from 12 per year from the baseline conditions, so 1980 to 2010, from 12 per year to 28 per year by 2040 to 2059. So more than a doubling within the next couple of decades and well within the time span that we're designing infrastructure for. So it'll be the responsibility of your breakout room to take the next 15 minutes or so to use that projection and create a climate impact statement out of it. So the projection being more very hot days. What is the hazard associated with that? What service area or asset might it impact? And just pick a one for now. And what is a consequence that may result from that? With that, we'll send through a link just to this chart associated with some of the impacts associated with extreme heat events. And yeah, I think we're ready to turn it over to the breakout rooms. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you to those who have sent in your climate impact statements. I'll leave this up for another moment or two. And I understand there may have been a little bit of confusion around that individual assignment earlier, working with the climate knowledge portal. Rest assured, as you access it, there are instructions at the very beginning of it and throughout the worksheet that do note where to go for those climate indices. So if anyone, if any groups have not yet, I'll encourage you to quickly sign in to menti.com, access code 33745633, and note the climate impact statement that your group came up with. But while we're wonderful. While we're waiting on that, want to give everyone a few minutes to get up, stretch your legs as well. So we are going to move to a 5-minute break now. Let's reconvene in 5 minutes, and just bringing up another slide. If you have not, please share that climate impact statement. And also in the chat, welcome you to just also share a little bit of information about yourself. So what's your favorite tradition or holiday and why? So in 5 minutes, we'll reconvene. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you took the opportunity to get up to stretch your legs, and as well as those who took the opportunity to share a little bit about their favorite holiday or tradition. Thank you also to those those groups that responded to the climate impact statement activity, and one of those responses is going to form the basis of the next couple poll questions. So while working on this activity within your local government, depending on how thorough your community is, dozens or even hundreds of climate impact statements may be created. In one local government I've worked with, for instance, we've gone through this process and ended up with more than 300 climate impact statements. And in order to streamline this process, you will need a way to relatively quickly assess the pertinence of the climate impact statement to your community. The vulnerability assessment stage is a way to do this expeditiously by applying the key concepts of, if the climate hazard occurs, will it influence the system? And if it does, is it going to matter? So vulnerability is a function of the exposure and adaptive capacity of a particular service or asset to suffer harm from a hazard event. Unlike risk, which is assessed in the next step, vulnerability assumes the impact occurs rather than factoring in likelihood. Exposure refers to the degree to which a given system may be impacted either directly or indirectly by changes in climatic conditions. Exposure is a necessary, but ultimately not sufficient determinant of the potential for harm. For instance, it is possible to be highly exposed to a hazard, but not particularly vulnerable. Think, for instance, of houses built on stilts. A river may flood, but because they're elevated, they're not particularly vulnerable to harm. And exposure is assessed on a scale between no impact on service delivery to having the ability to deliver that service completely compromised. Adaptive capacity, on the other hand, is a measure of a system's existing resilience to shocks or changes. So if you don't do anything really, or what's going to be needed to adapt to something compared to current conditions. So how resilient is that before you need to bring in interventions to maintain the service that you currently provide? Adaptive capacity is assessed on a spectrum from responses requiring high costs, significant interventions, and new skills, all the way to very little cost or intervention. And what significant or very little mean will vary by community. That's something that your, as a management team conducting this assessment, will have to decide. Each of those climate impact statements that you have come up with will need to be assessed against these two metrics. And if you are ever having trouble placing one on these scales, the handbook does refer you to a number of reflective questions that can help it really nail it down if one's giving you trouble. Things like, do current climate events cause disruptions? Will additional services be required? To what extent can other assets fill gaps produced by the failure of one assets or the redundancies? And how reliant is the service on the effective delivery of other service areas? So want to use really quickly, just to give an indication of this, one of those climate impact statements that was referred back to through Mentimeter. So one of the ones that was provided is the number of extreme, very hot days will impact natural infrastructure within a local government, increasing the risk of wildfire. So keep that one in mind for a minute. More heat, impacting natural infrastructure, increasing the risk of wildfire. And we're going to just really quickly rank that against two of these components. So can we launch poll 6, please? So using that scale ahead of you, what do you think the exposure of your community would be if you saw an increase in the number of extreme heat events, increasing the likelihood or risking, sorry, more wildfire due to impacts on to natural infrastructure? Okay, so this one really came out at that 3 to 4 ratio, so definitely edging towards the more severe end of the spectrum, but only in about 14% is it at that really critical level of exposure. The next question, using that same climate impact statement, extreme temperatures impacting natural infrastructure, potentially causing wildfires or changing wildfire risks, going to assess the adaptive capacity of your local government to respond to that. So to your parks or operations teams, for instance, to be able to minimize the risk associated with that. So can we launch poll 7, please? So again, using the scale in front of you here, to make sure that that wildfire risk doesn't increase, would it range from a scale of a 1 being very low adaptive capacity is going to cost a good deal of money, a lot of intervention, maybe new skills, to a 5 in this case being a good result? It's really not going to take that much effort. So this one came out really, almost a perfect standard deviation, came out really strongly in that 3, about 50%, saying requires some costs and intervention, but not a really overwhelming one. So altogether, this came in at kind of a 3-3, which after going through each impact statement, climate impact statement, sorry, that your team has conducted, go through this process and ultimately place it on a vulnerability matrix like this. Unlike risk, where you may have heard the calculation before, consequence times likelihood, that's not the way you do it with vulnerability, because they're rather opposing. High exposure is bad, high adaptive capacity is good. So instead, each of those should be placed on a matrix like this that you ultimately do or should develop yourself, with the various levels of what constitutes a low vulnerability, medium vulnerability, or high vulnerability. Using the kind of average of those polls we just did, that climate impact statement would fall at that 3-3, or on this matrix, a low vulnerability. So not really one to be over concerned with at this point. Typically, the more resources your community has, both in terms of staff time that can be put towards assessment processes, as well as funds that can be put towards response strategies and the like, the lower a risk threshold or risk tolerance that can be shown on this. So if you have a relatively robust budget that can be applied to this, you can shrink the number of cells attributed to low vulnerability, and ultimately carry increase the likelihood that particular climate hazard is carried forward into the risk assessment stage. As of this case, that 3-3 climate impact statement would be set aside for now and not carried forward to the next stage. Moving on now to the risk assessment portion. So any climate impact statements that note in that either high or medium risk should be carried forward to this next stage. Risk is going to be the most important factor in determining the priority of response actions to build climate resilience within your community. And as noted, risk is a combination of the likelihood and consequence of a climate impact occurring. The climate impact in this case represented by the climate impact statements that you created. The insights offered by a climate risk assessment will enable a user to develop harm reduction strategies that are targeted to the most important risk factors that the community is facing. And risk can be assessed in either quantitative measures, particularly in terms of things like asset load thresholds or financial boundaries, or using qualitative determinants. And typically, qualitative assessments are the less costly of the two options and allow a higher degree of direct participation by more stakeholders. A combination of these two is also, or can also be employed if you have quantitative information that you can carry forward. Assessing the likelihood requires thinking through the multiple components of a climate impact statement and assessing the probability of occurrence as a whole, namely that the likelihood that the climate hazard will occur. And if you look at for instance, the climate impact statement that we looked at, just extreme heat events, that being kind of broad enough and showing up in enough different climate projections that it would be a pretty high likelihood. So the climate hazard occurring, that it will result in a service disruption, an answer for which can be inferred from the vulnerability exposure score, and that the service interruption will result in a specific consequence. You have to think through those three components together. As such, it's an interpretation of climate information plus knowledge of local infrastructure systems that really only your local government is going to have. So for example, to assess a climate impact statement, one of those examples I provided earlier of intense rainfall flooding roadways, impairing emergency response, the team would have to evaluate the likelihood of severe rainfall increasing in severity or frequency, the rainfall leading to flooding, and that the flooding will impede emergency services. The probability of these three separate components should be taken together to assess a likelihood score. And likelihood can be assessed using the scale provided in the guide, with the higher likelihood ultimately translating to a higher degree of risk. And should be noted that likelihood can also be assessed in terms of acute or shock events that are single events, whether or not they may reoccur, things like floods or heat waves, but risks can also be more chronic ones, or stress events. So they're much more continuously occurring, and the impact will accumulate over time. So sea level rise is a really good example of a chronic hazard. And to gain the most accurate appreciation of impacts through your in your community, consequences should be assessed against multiple criteria. So a robust analysis can be conducted looking at a climate impact statement's implications to public safety, service interruptions, financial implications, environmental harm, and asset damage. And worth disassociating financial implications and asset damage, just because of things like the financial implications can include other factors of financial harm, things like is the local government likely to experience financial risk from lawsuits, for instance, or business interruption, where asset damage can include the just direct costs associated with replacement, for instance. And similar to exposure in the vulnerability assessment, the severity of a consequence is assessed on a 5-point scale from very low to very high. But the thresholds of differentiating these different scales have to be conducted by you, as it will differ greatly by community. For instance, a very high financial implication for a large city like Johannesburg would be very different than its smaller neighbor of Maseru. And it's also really worth noting that to get your consequence score, there are two different methodologies that you'll have to decide on in your community. Once you've noted the consequence score for each one of these, you'll have to find the overall consequence score that best captures it. And the two primary methods would be either taking the highest single consequence score or an average of the 5 scores together. And each of these does have its benefits or drawbacks. A weighted average can also be used. For instance, if a consequence score involves loss of life, for instance, it can be automatically listed as a 5. And using your likelihood and consequence scores, you can now multiply them together to find your risk score. Risk scores should be grouped according to the level of severity, with extreme risk noting an immediate need for intervention, high risk requiring intervention, but generally with slightly less urgency, moderate risk requiring consideration for some long-term improvement, but it's really not something that you immediately have to prioritize, and low risk requiring really no action at this point, rather than noting that it's been assessed. How wide these score brackets are will be dependent on your risk appetite, or the level of risk that an organization is willing to accept before any action is deemed necessary to reduce that risk. For instance, if resources are really highly constrained, that extreme risk bracket, which is currently 19 to 25, could be shrunk to like 22 to 25 if you only want to like immediately prioritize those very highest risks. Be sure to inventory all climate risk score, climate impact statements and the risk scores, as this will be useful information in conducting assessments in the future. Generally, best practices, these assessments should be reconducted every 5 to 7 years, for instance. And with all climate impact statements now having risk scores, you have a prioritization for action. However, those can be adjusted depending on community preferences, or if there are any capital allocations that can be slightly tweaked. So there is flexibility in that. And yeah, just to provide a few examples here of what some of those risks can look like in those different risk categories. So with a prioritized risk requiring risk management responses, you can begin to devise adaptation strategies. Adaptation actions are actions that respond to climate risk by reducing either the likelihood of an impact or its consequence. Adaptation actions should be designed at scale to the severity of risk that they are responding to. And unless a response is being built to accommodate a risk load likely to be experienced throughout the lifespan of an asset, or can work to reduce multiple risks at once, over designing an asset may not offer the ideal balance of costs, levels of service, and risk. And it's really worth noting that there is a wide array of adaptation options that a community can consider, with new capital assets like stormwater retention basins, for instance, being just one of them. Others can include retrofitting to increase the capacity of already existing assets, increasing system redundancy, adapting existing bylaws or zoning or codes or regulations, as well as operating and maintenance practices, updating capital plans to reflect asset capacity and vulnerability or system risk, just to ensure that money is flowing in the right direction. Training, awareness raising, or education, incorporating natural assets or natural infrastructure and asset management processes to ensure their effective operations and preservation, designing and managing assets to offer multiple resilience benefits, relocating assets, risk sharing, or further research. So a number of dimensions will also influence the development suitability of adaptation strategies, which can be assessed, which assess the basic cost benefit analysis, but can also go further. So this checklist being included in the handbook looks at things like how does the objective of the adaptation strategy balance within a community's overall economic, social, and environmental and cultural goals? What is the goal of the adaptation strategy in response to risk? Does it look to maintain current risk as conditions change, reduce overall risk levels, or just limit risk increases? How effective will the adaptation strategy be? How feasible is it? Do you have the capacity to implement it? Does the adaptation strategy introduce risk controls on more than one risk at a time? Is the adaptation strategy a no regret one? Will it yield benefits even in the absence of a climate impact occurring? How affordable is that strategy? What is the optimal timeline, as well as are there new capital projects necessary, or can retrofits or process changes adequately control the risk? How acceptable is the adaptation strategy to the community? Does this that part looking at things like overall equity considerations? Do you have enough information to proceed with the adaptation strategy? Is it flexible, and what co-benefits does it provide? So we're now going to move into another breakout session. So this one is going to continue to use that climate impact statement that we previously looked at. So yeah, let's continue with the severe temperatures or very high temperatures impacting natural infrastructure, causing wildfire. So using that, think through some of those options. So changing operations and maintenance for the research, risk sharing, etc. And what can your community do about that? Discuss in the group for a few minutes, and I will again launch a Mentimeter that your group can respond to. So let's open the breakout room for about 10 minutes. want to thank everyone again for your participation in those breakout rooms. So hoping someone from each team did capture what the response strategy to that climate impact statement was. And I'll invite you to share what your group came up with, what you can do to respond to wildfire risk in the chat for other participants to see. So the next stage of this overall process is really to take those actions that you've come up with. So for each climate impact statement, the next step is to, for each climate impact statement, you should have devised a response strategy. The ones that are severe enough to carry forward anyway. And the next step is to integrate them into your asset management action plan. As was noted, an asset management plan is ultimately a guidebook of what your local government should focus on. It may not 100% translate to the overall capital plan, but it gives that indication of the priorities of the community that can be translated into the capital plan later. So exercises within the within the handbook chapter encourage you to reflect on things like whether a particular adaptation strategy fits within a broader community goals, if it can be integrated with existing capital allocation or other co-benefits. And in order to put these strategies into motion, you will need to articulate the following, much of which has already been identified. So the specific action that you're proceeding with. So what's going to be necessary to address this priority climate risk. The number of actions included and their scope should be small enough that the local government has the resources, capacity, and planning timeline to see them fulfilled. If you do not get to all priority actions, remember that they can always be added later when resources become available or after you've completed some of those first ones. The rationale for implementing these actions. Refer to the results of your climate risk assessment to identify the gaps between today's reality and your risk management objectives. The time frame. Identify the ideal schedule for implementation. Operational changes, for instance, can be implemented almost immediately and are ongoing. Short-term projects may take under 2 years, medium projects between 2 to 6 years, and long-term projects more than 6 years. And particularly for longer-term projects, apologies, identify each year that dedicated attention is required. The ownership. So who is responsible in your local government for implementation? At a minimum, your asset management team should assign responsibility to each identified service area to ensure that action is accomplished. Resources, so identify the people, training, technology, or assets your team requires to complete an action. And funding. What financial resources does your team need to complete this action? And what are there upfront costs, recurring or both? And what is the funding source? So when you integrate adaptation strategies into the asset management action plan framework and process, you can incorporate your objectives into annual budgets, project timelines, long-term financial plans, and other project implementation pathways. In this way, senior management can understand and manage the financial life cycle of a multi-year tactical implementation plan across projects. So going to launch a few polls really quickly. So yeah, for a response strategies that you may have in mind for if your group did not come up with one for the wildfire risk that was previously discussed, think about, I did hear quite a bit of discussion around road networks, for instance. If you can think of a response strategy to preserve road network integrity and service function against more severe weather implications, think about that for now. So can we please launch poll number 15? So for a response strategy that you may have in mind, what would be that implementation timeline? Would it be more of a short-term one, medium term, or longer term? So yeah, really runaway result on that one would be medium-term response strategies, which is a pretty common timeline for most asset-related improvements. And could we also launch poll number 16? So going to get a little bit into who would be responsible within your community. So if that same response strategy you had in mind, would you allocate responsibility to a particular service area, a department director, an individual staff person, or just is it common practice within your local government to cite project plans but not really assign responsibility? So about 2/3 of respondents did come back with the department director, which all in all, pretty pleased to see. Generally, the service area or director level does tend to embed a higher degree of ownership within a particular local government. There's a higher degree of the word escaping me, but a higher likelihood of it being fulfilled because the person or service area owning it does have a higher degree of say compared to a more coordinator or more operational level staff. And just getting to some of those additional considerations for the rationale behind climate resilient asset management. So it's no surprise that due to tight budgets, local governments rely on tools like cost benefit analyses to make sure that resources dedicated to capital priorities, operations and maintenance, and other initiatives are worth the investment. This is one of the key components of asset management. And one of the key elements is making financial analysis is to make the cost of risk visible. So, and the work you do through a climate risk assessment accomplishes that. Historically, local governments have largely overlooked the financial value of adaptation measures because of poor understanding of risk and the difficulty in accounting for the costs of something that doesn't happen. Ultimately, the intention of adaptation is really severe consequences in your local government do not occur. So how do you account for the costs of them not occurring? Global analyses, however, have shown that the that climate resilience is a very good investment. The Global Commission on Adaptation, for instance, found that on average, enhancing the climate resilience of existing infrastructure and building new infrastructure to climate resilient design yields an average benefit to cost ratio of 4-to-1. And individual projects, for instance, can be much higher. One example in India, for instance, where the stormwater level of service was increased from being able to accommodate an 11-year storm to a 25-year storm, yielded a result of $248 for every $1 invested, which is about the best I have ever seen. Also very worth noting that your infrastructure does not work in a vacuum. Infrastructure systems are highly interconnected and interreliant, meaning that a failure in one asset could have consequences for multiple others. When evaluating risks, you should consider your assets as part of a system. And infrastructure systems are both interconnected and interdependent. For one example, consider a road running over a creek, channeled through a large culvert. By assessing the impacts associated with a flood on all three assets in conjunction, the road, the creek, and the culvert, you can more readily assess the service impacts that would occur as a result of a road washout. And the interdependent nature of infrastructure system means that weak points can have a greater potential to disrupt broader service delivery processes. Conversely, strategic resilience building interventions strengthen the system as a whole. So just to provide one really quick example, can we launch poll number 17? So if a main road in your local government were to be washed out during a flood event, what interconnected assets may be impacted, and check all that apply. So yeah, as you can see, to varying degrees, possibly on the basis of which assets are in each community, but every asset listed was selected as an interreliant asset. So one asset failure, particularly a critical one like a main thoroughfare in your community, can have quite a number of service-related impacts, and making that, like that wastewater treatment plant example right at the beginning of this session, a really important consideration to think of design level considerations being an important one on the availability of services. Drawing back to that climate impact statement example, we used natural infrastructure. So the past few years have seen a really significant increase in the recognition of that the natural environment, things like wetlands, forests, mangroves, and creeks, or combination of gray-green infrastructure like green roofs, bioswales, urban trees, and stormwater ponds can offer really substantial risk mitigation benefits and can deliver services at equivalent quality to gray equivalent, but often at a lower cost than fully engineered solutions. Um, for instance, to provide one example, in the Philippines, Conservation International is both restoring mangroves and building breakwaters to protect the population from potentially devastating storm surges. In addition, natural infrastructure can offer co-benefits such as water filtration, improved air quality, noise reduction, stormwater management, reduced energy consumption, and improved physical and mental health. And preserving natural ecosystems is much less expensive than restoring or replacing them. So infrastructure planners benefit by considering natural infrastructure as early as possible within the process. And that good rule of thumb to apply by is the most effective way to prioritize the use of natural infrastructure is to conserve what you have, restore what you lose, and build what you must. So just to get a bit of an indication of what your local government has done around natural infrastructure, could we please launch poll number 18? So has your local or your community taken actions to preserve features like wetlands, forests, or mangroves that can provide climate resilience benefits? That is a really encouraging result, actually. But just over 70% of respondents noted that their local governments have taken steps to preserve features of the of natural infrastructure, which I'm very pleased to see. That's a great response. And while not identical, disaster risk reduction and climate resilient asset management are complementary processes. The structured assessment of risk and using that data to inform strategic responses is a core tenet to disaster risk reduction, as detailed in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. The secretariat for which being the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. So knowing your climate risks places you in a better position to respond to other risks in a coordinated way. So having this process in hand and having a good sense of assets, for instance, that can be operationalized in the event of a severe flood event, and having response strategies that may be useful for early warning or things like that can also be relatable and transferable to other risks, for instance, around tsunamis, earthquakes, or other non-climatological hazards. Multiple risk management resources like the UNDRR's Disaster Resilience Scorecard for Cities emphasize the need for increasing infrastructure resilience to underpin community capacity to reduce hazard vulnerability. While other asset management aspects, such as having up-to-date inventory, can be crucial in deploying resources to respond to disaster events. Both asset management and disaster risk reduction are very much team sports within your local government. Interdepartmental collaboration, consultation, and breaking down silos between departments can help build accountabilities and communication networks that can be transferred to disaster risk reduction processes. And finally, both asset management and disaster risk reduction are ongoing processes. They will require work over time, including monitoring, ongoing improvement, and reflection in terms of lessons learned. And on that note, ultimately, no amount of work can ever make you fully disaster proof. Such a goal is just too expensive to contemplate. So there will always be lingering or residual vulnerabilities. If or when disasters strike, exposing those vulnerabilities, it offers an opportunity to respond to the event in a way that reduces the likelihood of it occurring again. At the same time as your local government employs resilience building interventions to mitigate the severity of potential climate impacts, you should also prepare for post-disaster reconstruction. It is important that the opportunity for climate resilient renewal be incorporated into a recovery process. And much of this can be planned in advance of any disaster happening. Having some of that business continuity planning, as well as having those response strategies for a number of risks can be employed, having them ready to deploy in the event of building back scenarios can be useful. And yeah, the climate risk assessment process provides critical information for informing post-disaster reconstruction. And following disaster events, information should be assessed, including the damage to assets, service interruptions, and the experiences of maintenance and operation staff. And the final consideration that's worth including in this process is that while the main intention of this session and chapter was to encourage asset management that enhances climate resilience, many adaptation strategies can also be designed to enable co-benefits. Efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions ultimately support the goal of climate risk mitigation by ensuring that the world ultimately experiences one of the less severe climate change scenarios. Low carbon resilience focuses on developing integrated strategies that incorporate both greenhouse gas emissions reductions and reduce vulnerabilities to climate change. To provide one example, while large infrastructure projects like seawalls can offer substantial risk mitigation benefits, that much concrete brings with it a fairly large carbon footprint. Instead, extensive mangrove planting can help reduce emissions while creating a buffer for wave activity, or a combination of a seawall and mangrove can reduce the emissions associated with that project. And every country in the world is signed on to the Paris Agreement with its commitment to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. Municipalities offer local solutions to national problems. And by adding climate mitigation lens to resilience building projects, you can help meet the Paris Agreement targets that your national government has subscribed to. And while it is not always possible by any means to follow a low carbon resilience framework, it does provide an ideal we can all strive towards. That is the end of my content for this session. I will open it up to questions that either Francis or I can respond to, and also just going to bring up the Mentimeter link again. So if you have feedback or the question that will be covered of what's the really most important takeaway that that you've learned in this lesson. Yes, in the meantime, welcome any questions that may come through in the chat. So one question came through around reducing greenhouse gases is better to do, but with what technology to evaluate the greenhouse gas? There are a number of internationally available free free energy modeling options, for instance, for relatively easy things like the energy consumption against different, to use one example, sources of lighting. But in terms of carbon resilience things, or climate resilience, one of the most important factors is going to be the embedded carbon in construction materials, or how much fuel is going to be needed for things like operations and maintenance. So the government of the Netherlands just launched a really great platform. It's internationally applicable, available in multiple languages as well, that allows you to look at how much carbon is embedded within each different construction material, for instance. And yeah, you can weigh different options through that. Or again, as you're thinking through some of the long-term operations and maintenance of particular strategies, think about how much fuel, for instance, is going to be required during that. How much gasoline or diesel, how much electricity, and where your source of electricity comes from. If it comes from a natural gas or coal plant, for instance, versus more hydropower or renewables, and use those as added lenses to find the response strategy that ultimately provides the level of protection that you're looking for, while also not exacerbating greenhouse gas emissions. What technology can we use for effective climate change adaptation? There are quite a number of different options available. Really fairly easy ones to install are using parts of the street, for instance, to install bioswales, which capture stormwater. One analysis is going to be released in Canada, for instance. Local governments, the number one cost to them, to their infrastructure, going forward, is going to be due to road deterioration because of higher heat. But in Canada, we don't usually experience really, really high heat events. So our concrete and asphalt mixtures don't tend to be selected for those considerations. By making a fairly small tweak to the types of concrete and asphalt we buy, we can significantly reduce the costs associated with those damage at a pretty minimal cost exposure by buying those different mixtures. Early warning systems and communication networks can be extremely useful for ultimately reducing harm. GIS technologies, even for mapping where harm is likely to occur within your community and prioritizing some asset level responses in that. Stormwater infrastructure, be it pipes, ponds, are all great. Increasing the resilience of a building envelope to make it more resilient to severe wind or severe heat. Or even things like very, very low effort or technological requirement options, like if you have critical components of your infrastructure in flood-prone areas, for instance, keeping servers or documents that your community relies upon in a basement that may be flooded, not doing that can really reduce the overall potential for harm. So getting some absolutely great feedback on what you're taking away. So thank you very much to anyone who has contributed that. And I think that's about everything I have. So I want to really thank everyone for attending this session. I hope it's provided useful information, and I will turn it back over to Daniel.
Thank you so much, Dustin. Please, a round of applause, virtual or in real time, for Dustin for a great job. I know some of you may be a little overwhelmed with the material. It was a lot, but as you know, Dustin is also the chief author of our chapter on climate resilience in the Handbook on Infrastructure Asset Management, and that handbook is available on our website, and it's very, very well written, that chapter. Dustin did it. It's very accessible and really follows what he said today. The whole structure of the presentation is based on the chapter. So you can go back to that. We'll have the recording of today's session on YouTube, and I would encourage you to go back and just look a little bit at whatever interests you the most, or where you think you could benefit from another look. Please don't leave. Stay on for about another 15 minutes. And the reason being that we need your feedback, we need your evaluation of today's session, as well as the previous ones. We want to hear what we can do better, what you like, how we can help you in the future. Also, we'll get a farewell statement from my boss, Ms. Caroline Lombardo, right after the evaluation part. And I will share a few more words on the next steps. So just bear with us. If you can stay with us for another 10-15 minutes or so. I'll give it over to Juana now. She'll explain the evaluation process to you. It's basically just answering a few questions online. And we'll give you about, I think, 10 minutes or so to do that. Very important to get your feedback. Take your time, be honest with us, and tell us what we can do better to help you even more in the future. And then after that, again, there'll be a short statement by my colleague, Ms. Caroline Lombardo, and I myself will also say a few more words on the next steps and how we can continue this collaboration on asset management. I think we're onto something, and I really appreciate your deep commitment. Over to you, Juana, just to explain a few the next few slides on the evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So as we've sent in the chat, there's a Google form link that we invite all of you to open right now. So it's a quick electronic survey for us to gather your feedback. Again, as Daniel emphasized, your feedback is highly appreciated, and this would be very helpful for us to improve the OSD sessions in the future. And this is also actually part of your requirement as you complete this certification. So if everyone can click on the message in the chat, you will find a Google form link.
Juana, how much time will we have to do that?
Yes, we'll give them right now 5 minutes, and then we will proceed with the closing messages. So if you can all open the link, please.
I said 10, but I think, yeah, five is more realistic. And it's not a lot to do. It's just a few multiple choice questions and a comment here and there. Also, we will give you, of course, we'll send you a follow-up email, and you can also individually send us more feedback if you want to elaborate a little bit more.
So right here, I am screen sharing the first page of the survey, but like we said, it's just a quick feedback form. So please, if you can all open the link in the chat so that we can start gathering your feedback. All right. We can see that everyone has started sending in their response, and we can again send the link as well via email. So for everyone who would like to give a more comprehensive version of their feedback, please feel free to do so. And as you continue completing the form, we would like to head on over to our final messages for today. So back to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Juana. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to fill out the evaluations and then following up on that later on as well. I already said that my colleague, Ms. Caroline Lombardo, would like to address you to say a few words. This is the last round of our online solutions dialogue, so it's I think a good time to look back, review a little bit what happened and what's next. Caroline, if you're already online, can you just say hello maybe, and we can give it over to you. Otherwise, I can also go into my presentation for a bit longer.
Yes, hello, I'm here, Daniel, if you can hear me.
We can hear you very well, so I'll hand it over to you, Caroline. Thank you so much.
Excellent, thank you. So hello, everyone again. I'm Caroline Lombardo, the Chief of the International Tax and Development Cooperation Branch in Financing for Sustainable Development Office in UNDESA. On behalf of our dedicated instructors, regional and national consultants, partners in the field, in particular UNCDF and UNOPS, I want to thank all of you for your committed attendance, your lively participation in these 2021 UN Online Solutions Dialogues. We can all take pride in what we have collectively achieved in these sessions. And my hope is that we can also take this achievement as our motivation to continue strengthening local capacities and promoting collaboration across sectors and among stakeholders for sustainable development. So let's bring the energy and engagement you've shown throughout these sessions into our asset management journeys from here on. Our journey in UNDESA began several years ago as we sought to leverage expertise of practitioners, researchers, change leaders in asset management in order to support local governments and national governments through technical assistance. We aim to deepen our existing field support and expand it to more municipalities, more countries. It's these experiences on the ground that directly and uniquely inform our development of innovative, state-of-the-art tools, such as the Asset Management Diagnostic Tool and Action Plan, made available to anyone and to any organization. We are really lucky to have realized this with some of you, and we hope to keep improving our tools and our approaches through further capacity development activities. The onset of the global pandemic last year, together with deepening inequalities, pressing challenges of climate change, environmental degradation, these compel us to be proactive. We have not only to mount effective response and recovery, but also to mitigate risks before they're realized. We need to strengthen our communities through more effective asset management, considering inclusivity, considering resilience. The roads we travel on, the water we drink, the air we breathe, the energy that powers our homes, our reliance on emergency services, parks we play in, these are all at stake. The nature of infrastructure asset management means we also need to be persistent. Financing for sustainable development is not only about securing investments, it's about assembling and managing the right combination of human, material, financial resources to maximize the value of the infrastructure assets you already own and to fully benefit from the synergies within effective asset management systems. But do not despair of a never-ending journey. Even with simple changes in current understanding, policy, and practice, governments can achieve early victories that will help ensure sustainability and value of public investments. We hope that each of you, as an asset management champion, will be proactive and be persistent in your efforts to shape a more sustainable and just future. This is our decade to take action for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and UNDESA is here to support you. So thank you very much, and please stay safe and stay well. Back to you, please, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for this very nice statement. Really, sorry, someone put on the music. Juan, if you can hold up on it for just 2 more minutes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Caroline, for this wonderful statement and really, you know, wrapping up those last few weeks here that we came together doing the online solutions dialogue, and also pointing towards the challenges ahead and the fact that this is only the beginning of our journey. As Caroline said, you are now asset management champions, and the more we have of you, the better it is for the world. This is the beginning of a collaboration. This is not the end. We've only started now on this journey together very recently. We had, I think, very nice experiences in these online solutions dialogues, but we all know that really the crux lies in the application in the field. And we hope that, you know, once this pandemic is under control, we can support you in the field again. And I think we've learned during the pandemic the power of virtual facilities and mechanisms, and we really are moving towards a nice model where we can harness both the online and field support. So this is the idea going ahead. If you can go back 1 slide, please, Juana. Just to repeat the certification process and what that all means. I mean, certification is important, but what is of course more important is the material that we try to convey during the online solutions dialogue, and the fact that you are engaged now as asset management champions in your local governments. But we promised you a certificate, and we'll stick to our promise. We'll keep that promise, of course, as long as these fundamental requirements here mentioned in the slide are met. We have given you homework in all 3 rounds of these online solutions dialogues. Not all of you could participate in all 3 rounds. We are aware of that. So that's why we have the recordings online. So those of you who just joined us this round or the last 2 rounds and haven't been in other workshops, please follow the instructions we'll send to you by email and look at the recordings 1 more time. That will enable you to do all the homework. Once the homework is done, sent to us, and many of you are working on it, please bear with us for a little bit. We have, as you can imagine, a lot of assignments to review. We want to not just have you send them over to us. We want to actually look at them and maybe help you a little bit, revise them and really put them into practice. So it'll take a few weeks, but you will hear back from us. And once again, what does it mean to have the certificate? Well, once you have that, you'll be eligible to apply for more technical assistance in the field, as well as the fact that you're eligible to apply for the UNCDF International Municipal Investment Fund. We mentioned that earlier. So we'll give you a bit more details on these results of certification and entitlements. Next slide, please. Thank you so much, Ivana. So again, all of these workshops were based and are based on the handbook that we issued together as UNDESA with UNOPS and UNCDF on managing infrastructure assets for sustainable development. That handbook is online. We'll send you the link one more time, or at least one more time after this workshop. You already have it, most of you do. Please go there, click on it, and check it out. It really is the basis of all the work we've done recently. So please take a look. Get back to us with any questions at the email address mentioned here, IAMH, that stands for Infrastructure Asset Management Handbook, at UN.org. I don't know, is there another slide, Ivana, or was that it? Sorry. Right. Now, all of these workshops will also feed into a massive open online course on asset management that we will offer you, which is a self-paced learning course, and we'll go into the issues of asset management in much more detail than we were able to within the last few weeks or so. So it's a nice complementary a way to work on asset management skills a bit more. We'll keep you posted. Probably by June, July or so, this massive open online course will be online, and it'll enable you to revisit the material and your colleagues to also look at the material in a self-paced way and fashion. We'll keep you posted on that. Now, what's next? Next slide, please. The planned capacity development activities of our office. Well, based on this training, we will get in touch with you and try to develop further tools, further material, and revisit our tools that we've developed in the handbook, especially those new tools on climate resilience, on health emergencies, as well as on data. And we will offer training of trainers to central government officials in the application of the asset management tools. But we'll also give continued field support to local governments. So any one of you that are interested in more field support and more technical assistance, please get in touch with us through the website, through the email, and let us know. We also want to go into a broader range of target countries. As you know, we've piloted these tools in 4 countries, Uganda, Tanzania, Nepal, and Bangladesh. But I think now there seems to be demand beyond those countries. So we will expand the selection of target countries. And of course, this will be based on demand. So please get in touch with us if you are interested in further support. And then we'll also look at how we can help ministries of finance, ministries of local governments to build an enabling regulatory policy and legislative environment for asset management, just to make sure that at the national level, there's an enabling environment in place for asset management. Last but not least, and we'll send you all those links again. Please visit our website on infrastructure asset management. There you will find the link to the handbook that we just showed you, a link to all of the recordings of the online solutions dialogues, a link to tools in different languages, and we keep on adding more. We will keep on adding more languages. The forthcoming link to the massive open online course, and then also a chance to request technical assistance with a very simple form that you can fill out and get in touch with us if you need specific assistance on overall asset management practices or on a specific area like data, crisis resilience, health, any of the tools we're offering. So please get in touch with us. And I should also mention the fact that there is more material online that we encourage you to look at, and we'll send you the links and the instructions. specifically, we prepared a few tools that can help local governments and national governments respond to health pandemics, and that go a little bit into what it means to respond with your asset and with better asset management practices to the challenges posed by health pandemics like COVID-19. It's not a lot of material to look at. It's very short and concise. It's about half an hour. And we'll encourage you to look at that as well. And there will be a very small assignment related to that. So this is just another way to build on today's workshop and see how to respond to crisis beyond climate change. We talked about natural disasters, but of course, health pandemics, we've all seen, are at the forefront of the local government agenda as well. And again, we'll send you the link to more videos, material, learning modules on that, but it will not take a lot of time on your end. All of what I just said will be summarized in an email. Again, thank you so much for being part of this asset management journey. Let's embark on it together. Let's keep in touch with each other, and let this be the beginning of a mindset change on asset management that really will help ensure our assets function for present and future generations and leave no one behind. Thank you so much. This is it. This is the last round of these workshops, but please stay in touch. I think what we'll do now is just a nice little group picture. So we can post that on our website. So I give it over to Wana just to officially close it and then play the nice music that helps us to say goodbye to each other and close this session. Wana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Again, it's been very wonderful having all of you join us for this workshop. So for our class photo, group photo for everyone, please turn on your video cameras and so we can see all of your beautiful faces. And our team will be taking screenshots. So since there's a lot of people in the meeting right now, if you can please hold your smiles as we take the screenshots. Thank you very much.
You can also wave if you want to.
Yeah, a wave would be nice. One more time. Hold those smiles. This is now the
Thank you.
virtual reality. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been wonderful. And we will be sharing the photos, I believe, also via email. So stay tuned for further announcements, and we'll send all the pertinent details via email, as Claire and Louise would normally do. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you again, everyone.